So, hi Max.
Hi Rufus.
And hi everyone. We're here for the second installment in our evolving effective altruism dialogues exploration together. I'm let's say, I know quite a bit about effective altruism, but I wouldn't say I was like kind of a paid up effective altruist, though I've encountered lots of effective altruists, worked with quite a few. But maybe Matt, you kind of almost, you're active member of the EA community. And in our episode 1, which you can find, we'll put the links in the chat. We talked about like what's amazing about EA, like what is EA, what's its strengths, and we're starting to talk about like, but what are kind of challenges that the effective altruist community are starting to kind of encounter that may mean that this is a moment where there's an opportunity and a need to evolve effective altruism, which has happened before, as you mentioned. I think in the last episode, there's been these kind of first wave, second wave effective altruism, and now it's time maybe for a third wave, or even an evolution of effective altruism into something completely different or completely new, like a butterfly that goes through its chrysalis and comes out the other side, birthing a new era. So yeah, where would you like to start? I know you thought quite a lot in your red teaming, fellowship work and other stuff like that. Where would you like to start in your kind of discussion about the kind of strengths and weaknesses, and particularly the places that EA maybe needs to evolve?
Yeah, so I suppose I think we really want to articulate like how the EA world, like what's underpinning the EA worldview.
Yeah.
And so I think like two key components are like capitalist realism. So the sense that there is no alternative to the status quo, that nation states and corporations, like liberal democracy and market economies, this is what the world is. Like they're real. They're not like constructed by people. So there's this naturalization of all that currently exists. And then because of that, there is, I think an implication of that is techno-solutionism. So if like political and economic institutions are set in stone, then how do we solve problems? We have to utilize technology, and technology is dynamic and adaptive. And so I think the two go hand in hand.
Yes.
So I think this is underappreciated within EA and by EAs. And there's like a long history of how EA formed. That's very like historically contingent and is unacknowledged. So I can get more into that.
Let's go a bit more into that.
So for instance, I've written this piece tracing Peter Singer's thought over the span of his career. Singer's considered the grandfather of effective altruism, which would make Will McCaskill the father. And so there's a lineage. And Singer has throughout his career, he's when he's been asked about systems change versus charity, or like reform versus transition, or like alternatives to capitalism, he consistently comes back with the same fairly like reasonable like cruxes. Like he says, like until someone can point out to me that there is a more desirable alternative and show a viable path to get there, then we'll just do as much good as we can within the constraints of capitalism. And that's exactly what Singer and effective altruism has done. Like they've leveraged billionaires to turn them into effective altruists, and donated money to the most effective causes, which don't include trying to design an alternative system or transition to it. And so that was quite surprising to me, that they point out these cruxes and there's this open research question, but then they don't pursue it. They just close the door on it. Like these are our presuppositions. I just have to act from this basis.
And to be fair to Singer, when you read it, I mean, Singer was both, obviously an altruist, but also a leftist, or progressive. Mm-hmm. But when you read those pieces, I think Singer articulates a potentially mistaken but common sense position in the late 20th century, which is, oh my God, radical change is basically equated with totalitarian and communism or something like that. And it was disastrous. You know, it was millions of people died, even leaving aside the totalitarian disasters which happened on the left and the right, you know, fascist. You know, it was an ineffective economic system. It was impoverishing, blah, 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 blah. And whether that's exactly true, if we examine it, it's a tendency to be kind of received wisdom, at least in the West. And so Singer's not just saying, oh, we take these for granted. He kind of points this kind of common sense, don't we all know that that doesn't work kind of thing. And I think one of the points you're getting at is we're making this jump from, you know, oh, some cases really didn't work, you know, authoritarian communism in the 20th century did not work, to all paradigmatic change should not, you know, is off the table.
Yes.
And that elision is not obvious. But I'm just kind of emphasizing there are kind of these, we've got to acknowledge the reasonable common sense reason. In my experience, when you talk about what I would now term like paradigmatic change, it's just a major shift in your economic system or your social system or your culture, people immediately think of the failed experiments of the disastrous failed experiments in the 20th century with communism and things like that.
Yes, it's the only frame of reference and like evidence base that people have. And so you see this recurring. So Toby also says that he hopes that we'll arrive at a point in history where we stop with radical social experiments. So there's this end of history ideology that like the case is closed on like what the governing paradigms by which civilization should be organized.
We've got the best we can get.
Yes, yeah. So, so it's tantamount to like a quasi-religious theodicy. Like we've arrived at the best of all possible world systems, right?
Yes.
So it's emulating Leibniz. So I found that quite amusing and also quite strategic that most effective altruists are atheists. So to point out that you're holding this like quasi-religious belief, like it at least throws it into question. Like it could be true that we're in the best of possible world systems, but you should at least know the ideological function that belief could serve if we're not. Yes.
So let's just to nail it down, the points, first of all, is this kind of capitalist realism, this naturalism of the systems we have. I mean, Roberta Unger, who I'm a big fan of, I early call this, this sense of false necessity or the dictatorship of no alternatives. There is no alternative to capitalism. Radical change is off the table. And markets are, and this is crucial, I think, are natural. It's not just that they're a creation. These institutions somehow reflect the deep biological, nature of humans. We're selfish, rational, utility maximizers. When we try anything else, then the market which appeals to our self-interest will be in trouble. But one is that rules off the table, basically interested in kind of social and paradigmatic change.
Do you mind if I just add that?
Yeah, please.
So this is where the effective altruists are now being pitted against the effective accelerationists.
Yeah.
But they share this underlying belief in the system so the effective accelerationists are justifying it on like a physics first perspective. They're saying from complexity and entropy, markets are just this emergent phenomena, and they just mirror the structure of the universe. Like they're expressing the thermodynamic will of the universe, which is a line that they use. And so it's quite interesting that these two camps that are seen as opposed, they share this common belief. But yes, go on.
You're saying so. First is this kind of capitalist realism, and then you were saying the second
techno-solutionism,
which comes out of that, which is we mainly look for solutions to our problems, whether that's malaria in developing countries, or other problems of poverty. They're not due to structural violence or deep inequalities of the capitalist system. We should address them there by giving money and so on. And the solution is technology. I mean, for me, I wanted to add that in my encounters with it, I guess one at a maybe more surface level issues that I'd seen in the critique that I would complement the points you just made is I would call the drunkard and the lamppost problem. Just to set that out in case people listening haven't familiar, which is that, you meet someone on the street late one night, they're a little bit worse the wear for drink, you ask, they're looking around on the ground, you say, oh, you're okay, what are you looking for? And they say, oh, I've lost my keys. And so you start looking with them, and after about 10 minutes, you're like, I've really looked here and I can't see any keys. Where exactly did you lose them? And they point some way, 50 meters up the street, and they say, over there. You're like, well, why on earth are we looking here? And the guy says, well, there's light here. It's dark up the street. And so this point that we search and we look where there's light, even though that's not maybe where the actual issue lies. And in particular, in general, in effective altruism, there's this close connection that we talked about in the last episode with rationality and reason, and then ultimately kind of with metrics and assessment. In order to do the best good, we want to be able to kind of assess the best good. We want to use reason. And that's, as we said, really admirable in many ways. It is a good thing to use reason. We do want to avoid just being given by the fuzzies and the feelies. We want to be carrying a little bit more hard nosed, if you like. But at the same time, it can become a trap in the sense that we start looking at issues or problems that are available for assessment. And in my experience, at least personally, when I was an economist, so I was full up utilitarian assessor at some point, and also like a policymaker and activist, was that the set of things that you can actually assess, particularly really rigorously, like with randomized controlled trials, but even that you can really talk about are quite limited, actually. And many of the things you're most interested in that might make a difference in society, you don't get to run an experiment. You don't have a planet B where you can run two systems in parallel and see which works out better and then go with that one. So while there is, that doesn't mean there are natural experiments, there are clever statistical ways we can look at problems. There are lots of things, and I think we'll come to them at the kind of most important level that aren't accessible like that. And I also think that leads to something that we'll come to when we talk about pragmatic utopianism, that is really, if you pull on that thread, I think you go somewhere quite interesting, because you basically start to ask, well, how do we make choices then? How do we make choices about where to spend effort or how to shape society? We don't want to discard reason entirely. And yet we don't want to also be in a state where only things we can kind of A/B test or do randomized controlled trials or get reasonable data on are available. Are there ways to combine reason with other ways of making sense together, collective sense making? And I would say that leads you towards wisdom. Actually, and this is what you really evolve from reason to wisdom, which is not discarding wisdom. It's not moving into magical intuition, but it is a kind of transcend and include step. And in particular, I would say one of the, not ironies, but that sort of goes on in effective altruism in my experience, that when you actually ask people, how do you decide that AI risk is so important versus some other risk? How do you decide that animal kind of rights or animal suffering is important versus, I don't know, dealing with LGBTQ rights? The answer that comes back is actually quite fuzzy to some extent. It is sometimes reason-based, but there are these kind of like, oh, there's a 1 in 6 chance or 1 in X chance of AI taking over. When you go and look, it's like, well, how on earth did you arrive at this? You're using something other than pure reason. There's no scientific way to assess the exact risks of an AI, extinction-based event. And so what I think that is interesting is that that's already going on within the effective altruism movement, which is how do we reason in this rich way? And what are people actually really doing when they come up with these choices? And I remember, to finish at the very beginning when I was accounting, I asked about particularly climate then, at that time, this was mid-2010s. I always noticed that climate change and climate crisis was not seemingly very high on the effective altruist agenda. It wasn't that there weren't people interested, but relative to AI risk and other things. And people say, well, it's because AI risk is neglected, it's an extinction potential event. Their view seemed to be that climate crisis wouldn't lead to everyone dying. We'd still be able to rebuild civilization. But the thing was, when you actually said, well, how did you work that out? Where's the math that you've worked out your marginal return of spending $1 on AI versus this? That isn't there because it doesn't exist. And this is what I'd encountered as an economist when I was doing the fancy version of this called social cost benefit analysis back in the 2000s. That was an area I specialized in and advising government. Do you build this road, or do you spend money on opening up some data set? How do you compare these apples and oranges? And as again, I want to emphasize at the end, it's useful to use reason and even to kind of do math, but it can blind us. We can start thinking we're doing something that's kind of science in the way that physics is science, versus something much more reason informed. Like I always think of the law. The law is reason informed. Lawyers' theory use reason, but it's not reducible. It's not physics. So that was one point. And I think the second, which really struck me, having been involved in it, is let's say you actually are interested in implementing some of these things. For example, the obviously relevant one for Effective Altruism now would be around AI safety and regulation. This requires political action. It's a collective action problem. It requires political solutions. And that was something that I noticed seemed to be often dismissed. And I think we'll come back to what you're talking about as, hopeless or irrelevant, that you couldn't, politics was dirty and messy and complicated and irrational a little bit. And so we wanted to focus on areas where we didn't need, in a way, politics as much, at least. We could act individually, we could do engineering type solutions. But that seemed to me a real gap. From my perspective, and I'd like to come back to that, collective action problems and politics in that sense, with a small p, the ability for us to work together to find solutions together and enact them, is basically at the core of most of our opportunities to really transform the quality of life of people on the planet. And you could, by the way, even argue that capitalism was based on solving collective action problems like secure property rights and things like that. But yeah, that was also something that seemed really missing. And I remember reading Bostrom's Superintelligence, where kind of at the end of the book, collective action around AI is almost like just dismissed out of hand. Like in a few paragraphs, having spent a whole book on kind of the alignment problem. In fact, why it was impossible to solve, he kind of then dismisses collective action at the end and says, we should just spend more time on the alignment problem. Fund me to do research on that. I'm being a bit unfair, but it was striking how easily it was dismissed. So yeah, I'd love to. Those are kind of two additional points I think complement what you were saying as these kind of lacunae.
Yeah, so I think something that I'd like to clarify is that the drunk and the lamppost problem that you point out
is well known.
Yeah, it is not just about measurability bias or like an evidentialist bias. It's more about what areas of the solution space are lit up and which are perceived as dark.
Yes.
So that's I think that's really crucial because I think effective altruists have received this like measurability bias criticism repeatedly.
And they've inoculated against it.
Yes. And they reject it because they're like, oh, we also have like the long-term future fund, which is looking at more speculative opportunities to do good and has like a lower burden of evidence. So,
but there are these blind spots which are hidden, not only hidden, but hidden from you don't see, and you don't see that you don't see them.
Yes. Yeah. So yes. Yeah, like Bostrom is like an exemplar of like the technocratic solutionism. So in relation to mitigating like existential risk, he proposed like a high-tech panopticon, a global surveillance state. And this was on the basis that if you have rogue actors that have access to like decentralized, weaponized technology like AI, then you just immediately, because there's some portion of those actors that have like malicious motives, you end up with an existential event. And now he briefly comments like, oh, what if we just kind of tried to eliminate or like change the distribution of motivations in the population? And then he dismisses that as like it would require mass scale genetic engineering. So again, he like naturalizes the problem. And there might be some portion of the population where like they are just like genetic psychopaths, or they have these predispositions. But I think most of the apocalyptic demographic are like they've just been socialized into like certain ideologies. And so can we like align human collective intelligence? And like Bostrom says, no, we can't. Like we can't solve, and then we can't solve the collective action problems. So we have to just impose a top-down monolithic solution.
And what's so bizarre about this, always, so it's so blatant, is it's somehow like we can't rely on humans to coordinate, but we can rely on them to coordinate to design a system that itself will impose these things that we want reliably, and particularly with, you know, yes, it's a bizarre situation. It's a bizarre way of thinking.
Right, it's like kicking the problem down the road.
Yes.
Right? It's like, or begging the question.
It's begging the question. We can't be good, but we can design something that will make us good.
Yes.
You know?
Yes. There's this question of the AGI developer alignment problem. It's like, okay, we need to align AI systems, and it turns out that the like human intelligence systems that are designing AI are misaligned. So they're going to develop AIs that are also misaligned. There's going to be like a clear mechanism of inheritance. It's like the sins of the father. And this is like not really recognized, or is just accepted as like we just have to like hack it with the techno solution. It's like, but this it's a Hail Mary.
And it's a good example of but I'm saying it's also a good example of what you're saying about this blind spot, or this tendency that the measurability drunk alone post critique is less about, oh, we can't run an RCT, though that may show up, but this much more subtle and maybe significant way that certain solutions, certain ways of looking at the problems are dismissed. They're naturalized in the sense it's impossible to change that. Or, for example, there's this kind of techno-solutionist faith. You know, in here, it's like we can't align humans, but somehow we can align the panopticon that's surveilling all of us. You know, it's like no one can abuse that. You know, like to become, you know, to do bad things. You know, there's this tendency to have faith in the machine more than man and woman.
Yes, yeah.
Which is one example of this tendency in the solution space to look at certain solutions. Yeah.
The like higher level concept is tractability. Yeah. And so like if you have evidence for an intervention, it makes it appear tractable, right?
Yes.
But there are like other ways in which you could perceive something as like tractable without having like like metrics behind it.
Yes.
So you could have a theory of change, right? So this is where it deviates. Maybe like parts of that will be supported by evidence, but there's a more complex picture of like how a certain moral effect will occur.
Yes. Well, and more conventionally, I think people are neglecting of the way our concepts and beliefs are collectively and culturally created. So what I mean is we live in a moment where for example, the faith in solving the alignment problem was clearly higher than the faith in solving a collective action problem.
Because that's why they're dedicating time to solving the AI alignment problem rather than...
We live in a moment where engineering, you know, it seems magical. You know, people are used to technologies that they have in some way seeming magical. And I think it leads people, you know, to misunderstand the magic in a way. They think the magic can solve everything without understanding different types of problem. And this is a piece we've written about actually quite a lot, Life Itself, 5 or 6, 7, now 8 years ago, was this aspect of the category errors. You know, when you mistake something in one category for another. I mean, the obvious bad category, you know, there's non-poisonous steaks and there's poisonous steaks. If you make that category error, you're in trouble the wrong way. You know, or, you know, there are many examples of that where if as humans we make a category error, it's bad. And in this case, what are problems that are tractable with technology and which are not? And that I think is part of this. And so as I said, that leads this sense of constantly everything is going to be solvable, or we only can solve things with technology.
Yes, so this is another like critique of effective altruism, which is like cause area compartmentalization, that they silo off global problems into like these discrete boundaries. So there's
Sure.
like AI alignment is like its own problem that's contained, and it's primarily technical. So there's technical AI safety that we can do. Then there's like governance, but that's really there just to facilitate the technical AI safety.
Yes.
And so there's a technocratic solutionism, I think, is the proper frame. And I think now there is more of like a socio-technical and complex systems turn to recognizing that the development of AI is embedded in wider systems that are aligned or misaligned. And so in order to solve the AI alignment problem, you need to solve the human collective intelligence alignment problem. And this is becoming like manifest because technocratic solutionism is failing. Like they've tried to pass bills with very minimal legislation that have even had like the AI firms involved in writing them, and they still can't pass that. Like it gets vetoed.
Because there are AI companies and others who don't want it to pass.
Right, because there's already been human takeover. There's been regulatory capture.
Yeah.
There are like commercial and military incentives to develop this technology as fast as possible. And so you're coming up against like the problem of politics that EA has been averse to, and now it has to face. Because I think, again, like when AI safety was originally being discussed in the EA community, it was very like pre-paradigmatic, and it was esoteric. It was just a niche subculture discussing this. And so they weren't having to deal with like the political implications because it was just like a non-issue.
Yes.
But now the technology has advanced much faster than anticipated, and suddenly they didn't have like a political strategy in place. And this is in part because they're like averse to the complexities of politics and also just humans.
And politics is messy and deals with power.
Yes.
And it's frustrating. I think this is, I've been a programmer in my life, and this is, and I've been an activist, and programming is so much more satisfying because you solve you fix a bug. There's a bug, you fix the bug, the program runs. There's this incredible, like playing computer games, really payoff in engineering in general, but particularly in computer software engineering because of the pace and rapidity of evolution. And you don't get that in politics. You just do not get that. In fact, as an activist on the kind of, I'd say, the public interest side of many issues, you lose repeatedly. It's not nearly as satisfying. And I think, just to say, these kind of psychological factors play into this blind spot aspect. So yes. I want to turn a little bit, which is just to recap that what we're saying is that if you are an effective altruist, you care about doing good better.
Yes.
Right? That's the bottom line. And why we're actually having this discussion is that what we're going to suggest here, is that there are things that EA is really missing at the moment potentially, that would enable the effective altruist community to do good better. That because it's like, wow, there's these whole options on the table that aren't just even being seen, and that are not being taken into account. And we should start seeing that out, because otherwise you can have a critique but no solution. And I think we're going to term it pragmatic utopianism.
Yes.
At the moment, as the term we've used, obviously, and at Life Itself for like last 8 years. So I was saying, let's look at pragmatic utopianism, which is from effective altruism to pragmatic utopianism, from effectiveness to pragmatism, and from altruism to utopianism. One is the utopian aspect, in the sense that we can imagine radically better, wiser worlds, and that change has happened in the past. This is not just like, oh, let's sing John Lennon's Imagine and dream that there'd be no war and everyone would love each other. If we look at the past of human history, there are moments. There's both gradual, change, particularly. Recently we can see, the just constant compounding of material growth, but that itself came through a breakthrough. For hundreds or thousands of years, we did not have the Industrial Revolution. We did not have the level of innovation we have today. So there are these kind of major shifts in mindset, in organization of society, and of all of the systems and culture that goes with that. So first of all, that is possible. That's like one thing. And then the other thing is also that the path to that does not necessarily have to involve revolution.
Yes.
You can have a big vision of where you're going to and take incremental steps towards it. And that's really important. And I think, is the case if you look at modernity, which is underpinning the Industrial Revolution and so on. We can come back to that. I think the second one is this evolution of like, what do we evolve reason into or rationality into? We want to keep the good things. We want to keep epistemic humility. We want to keep our interest in data and facts and evidence and all those things. But is there, when we're making sense in a complex world, in a world which is combinatorially explosive in its complexity, when there are many, many things that we could do, there are many Pascal muggings that we could be subject to. How do we make these choices in the face of those, and not just do so in a random way, but in a kind of somehow coherent way? Now that's this. I'm going to point out there's not really an answer. If someone came along and said, "I know what wisdom is," you shouldn't believe them. But we know features of wisdom. I mean, that's what Socrates was teaching, philosophia. So that's, I think, the other aspect is to a serious exploration of how can we expand our sense-making capacities to make choices together wisely. And then finally, I think the other major pillar for me of pragmatic utopianism is saying, well, actually, the major source of breakthroughs in our society in terms of addressing existential risk, in terms of ensuring the long-term sustainable flourishing of all of the living, really relates to solving collective action problems. There are other things, but at root, many of the issues we encounter come down to that. Technology can be very helpful, many things, but even technology is enabled by collective, solving collective action problems. The use of technology, the ability to innovate, and so on. Our innovation comes from public funding that funded all this AI. Most AI research is based on public funding and collective funding at some point. So, and the way finally to solve, not to solve, but to address collective action problems, there are many things. We could talk in a whole nother episode about that. But crucially is what I would call the final pillar in pragmatic utopianism, is the primacy of being. That in solving collective action problems, there is, of course, new institutional structures, new ways of voting, citizens' assemblies, you name it. There might also be technology, new ways of aggregating voting, new ways of discerning people's preferences, and just the fact we have Zoom calls or video calls that we can connect, and all these things. But at their root, the most important is shifts in the being of human beings, in that when we went from having a God out there in a way of Catholicism, that we had to go and do our, apologize for our sins and go to the priest, but there was a God in here, the Protestant God who's like watching my thoughts. While we might not like it, that God, I was much more likely to be trustworthy if I thought that God was watching me all the time than if he only watched me on Sundays. But these, I'm giving a joke, but these kind of things, these religious innovations and other kinds of innovation, the belief in the importance that technological progress was possible, that understanding of nature was possible by human minds using empirical techniques and science and reason. That wasn't believed very much 1,000, 1,500 years ago in the West. And if you don't believe that, you're not likely to go and do much of it. So this shift in being lies at the root of how we can have breakthroughs in the scale of collective action problems we solve. Now, I know you've had a lot of thought, and I've just set out, I know you'd have things both separately to add and things you'd like to clarify, but just wanted to set that out as those the four pillars. Radical, a radically wiser world is possible, a radically better world is possible, paradigmatic change is possible, there's collective action problems at the root, and that the primacy of being and solving collective action problems, the inner dimension, the cultural dimension is central.
Yeah, and then the other one you mentioned was that revolution is not the only pathway towards this future.
Yes, yes. Crucial.
That's crucial. Because
say more about that. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So when effective altruists respond to the systems change critique, they tend to say, "Oh, we're not revolutionaries. We don't want to burn the system to the ground." And this is just caricatures, like at least myself, in that I'm not advocating for that. But I think it's a reasonable response because most people that are making this systemic change critique are Marxists and socialists and communists.
Giving us a bad name,
Yes,
Max.
yes. But that just means they're stuck in this like false dichotomy of we either reform the system and alleviate suffering as much as possible within its constraints, or we use violence and coercion and revolution to overthrow the system or abolish it. So there's this antiquated 20th century terminology that's being used, when my position is like we need to design a post-capitalism for the 21st century, and we can have a design science revolution or a democratic transition. So it's not reliant on, I also think it's like, this isn't just me being like an idealist. It's also that like revolutionary change is not viable. Like, I think there's such an asymmetry between states and civilians. Maybe you have like defectors, but I think if you go down that route, like you won't be successful.
Sure. So pragmatically, you're against it.
Yes, pragmatically, I'm against it, as well as perhaps on more principled grounds. But
well, I think the other thing we can just to say is, what I noticed at least is that effective altruists often are quite big on the Industrial Revolution. I think if we polled them, most of them would think it was a good thing for human in the history of humankind. Maybe not for the whole of the biosphere, but for humans, at least so far. And, you know, the Industrial Revolution does have revolution in its title, and was not obviously a violent revolution the way we normally think. It was violent maybe in other ways, we should come to that, but it wasn't you know, this kind of classical overthrow, we're going to execute all the aristocrats.
Yes, it's more the Kuhnian use of the term revolution.
Yes.
It's like a revolutionary paradigm. So yeah, in the philosophy of science, there's this model that there are like various paradigms throughout history that are incommensurable. And so they're just operating on different assumptions. And the history of science is not just like linear progress, but is transition or shifts from one paradigm to the next. And so the term like revolutionary science or like a revolutionary paradigm change, it's like that is the kind of change that that we're talking about, and that pragmatic utopianism is.
Paradigmatic change would be the best thing we'd say, rather than radical, I think, which even gets people. I shouldn't use that term. I should say paradigmatic change. I use radical because it means going to the roots in the original sense, radix in Latin. So let's just say, I mean, so Kuhn, we can have a bit of a no here, but Kuhn, I think, is the first using it in this way, the term paradigm, you know, in the structure of scientific revolutions. One of the, you know, what we want to say about a bit that is that also it makes sense if you thought, if we just go off on a bit of a tangent here, I was big into my dynamical systems. I was a maths undergrad and postgrad, and you think of equilibria in any complex system or any dynamical system, you know, you don't normally have a continuum of equilibria. You move, you know, a system can be perturbed, it's getting more and more perturbed, but then it often flips. And classic examples are avalanches. The system is stable, you're adding more and more snow, maybe it's moving a little bit, and then suddenly there's a massive system change, then the avalanche falls. And this would also suggest to us that social change, even with incrementalism, would lead to sudden equilibria shifts. So that's what we've seen in history, which is you go for a world that's dominated by feudalism and the Catholic Church, where authority comes from the priest and then the Pope and then God, to even in Protestantism, even when you've got Christianity, you're suddenly in a world where you have church services where there's no pastor, where Quakers sit in a circle in silence. I mean, that is just such a radical democratization or shift. And it wasn't, you know, and so I'm just trying to say is that we can see these really significant shifts in societal attitudes and behaviors, even with even incremental change leads to paradigmatic shifts at some point.
There are phase transitions.
Yes, exactly.
Like positive feedback loops. And I think there's this, like within EA and more broadly, there's this analysis that technological change happens very quickly. Like it's exponential, whereas social change takes generations, hundreds of years. And so if we're going to have agency in the world, we have to adopt technological change as our strategy. Now, this, again, is premised on like a false division. It's like what about socio-technical change, like accounting for the fact that we could wield technology towards affecting social change? But that first, like, you have to have like aligned actors like wielding that technology. So there's like social change that has to happen first, and so this is the primacy of being.
Yes.
And so it isn't like, because at first it may have sounded like I was just reiterating
techno-solutionism,
but I'm not.
No, you're making a very good point that technologies are created in human context. Technologies are kind of created for purposes. Sometimes the use is accidental, but the way they're created and shaped comes from humans. And what about their values and intentions? I think the other thing I want to emphasize is the drunkard and there's a kind of version of the drunkard and the lamppost problem going on again. It keeps showing up here.
Yes.
I think it's actually one of these really important ideas, because basically we say something like, it's quite, if you really want to watch this sleight of hand that's going to go on here intellectually, because if you do it too quickly, you miss it. Like, right? Like the thing. So what we can say is we say, let's say we want to pick something concrete. Like, let's say the risk from AI, super intelligent AI, and killing all humans or being used by a rogue actor or itself. What we can say is we can say, but change is happening so quickly. Technology is moving so quickly. Social change, cultural change happens on the scale of generations. There's no point. We can't wait for cultural change. We have to focus on the technology. But it's like, it's again the drunk the lamppost. It's like, well, if the only way, or the only really credible way to address, for example, the underlying drivers of these problems, which I would say is collective action, like, hey, we need to either coordinate to regulate AI safety, or even to restrict the development of AI for a period of time, or whatever else we need to do collective action-wise, we kind of have this movement where we're like, we agree on that, but because the only thing that moves fast enough is over here under the light, even though the problem is up the street in the dark, which is solving the collective action problem, we're going to focus on technology because it moves so quickly, because culture doesn't move fast enough. But the real answer to that is to say, listen, it doesn't matter how bright the light is here. If your keys aren't here, it doesn't matter how much searching we do, we're not going to find them. And so if the actual problem is a collective action problem, and technology is not going to help us really solve a collective action problem, which I think we can make a very good argument it's not going to do very much about. It can assist, but it's not going to cause a breakthrough in that. Other than this weird panopticon, we can have a collective action problem because we'll have this super intelligent regulator in AI, which is like just begging the question, how's that aligned? But if we really sit here, we're like, well, the problem is up the street in the dark. And it doesn't matter how fast technology is going, we have to do the cultural work. We have to be patient. And we have to just hope, worst case, we just have to hope that people are wrong about AI timelines. Because if they're right, we're not going to solve it with technology. We're not going to solve it with culture, and we're doomed. But I don't think that's the case. There's at least some probability that we have got time and we can solve collective action problem. But I just want to emphasize, it's like someone saying, listen, we're all going to die if we don't find the keys in the next 5 minutes. So we might as well only search under the lamppost, even though we know they're not here. It's just a really, really bizarre logic. But it's a sleight of hand, you see, when you go from what's possible or like would be desirable, that it's a technology problem, to making it a technology problem. However much you want your keys to be there does not make them there.
Yes. Yeah, it'd be very nice and simple if we could just solve the AI alignment problem and have a benevolent superintelligence that solved all our problems for us. And so there's almost a very like infantile and theistic desire that you want an AI god or an AI nanny to take care of you and to solve the problems that
now you're saying face. I want to riff on this for a second, because you just really got me, my synapses firing, because obviously there's this contention, it's difficult for us to establish, but the arrival of these kind of the all-powerful gods, the shift from the kind of gatherer-hunter society to settled agriculture, and particularly agricultural empires, sometime in the Neolithic period, between 10,000 before the Common Era and like 5,000 before the Common Era. And what we know is by 5,000, 3,000, where we have like the Epic of Gilgamesh, we have the Old Testament, we know there's this shift to these kind of gods who they control the weather, they're all powerful, to some extent you have to sacrifice them, you have to kind of, please them, appease them.
Yeah, there was a human-God alignment problem, right?
Right. But what I'm trying to say is there's this thesis that the gatherer-hunter gods are not like that. Yes, they're powerful. They're a bit more like the ancient Greek gods even. You can kind of interact with them. You can sometimes deceive them. But if you piss them off, they'll do things to you. You won't get good hunting again, or you'll break your leg. But there's this very different relationship. And there's this contention that as you switch to agriculture, and suddenly, as a gatherer-hunter, yes, if you don't find the game today, it's not great, but you could go hunting somewhere else different tomorrow. So if you annoy the god in that area and he therefore kind of curses your hunt, it's not the end of the world. Where suddenly when you're stuck somewhere and the grain harvest fails, you're going to die. You are now dependent on the weather, basically, and the effects of disease, because now you're in settlements where the disease happens in a much bigger way, you have epidemics. But you've suddenly got this tendency to want a god in this Santa Claus-like way. We want a way to kind of, in a way, project our fears, our dependency, our profound dependency on the weather for life and death, on, disease, random disease that may come, that complete ununderstanding and kill my whole family. I'm going to project that fear onto this all-powerful entity that I can then appease. I can sacrifice virgins. I can do offerings. I offer my first son, as Abraham is about to do, right? I'm going to kill my firstborn in order to get good weather. And I think there's this incredible analogy with now, that we have this fear, perhaps justified again, like the weather mattered, but I'm going to project onto this kind of AI God, like it's going to say, just as technology is endangering us, just as God could curse us and take away the rain, he can bring it. And there's this incredible, as you say, these kind of deep human dynamics and archetypes of wanting to externalize and project our fear onto, whatever this is. And right now that's AI, but in the past it was some God voice coming from the wilderness.
Yeah, the classical Feuerbachian or Marxist critique of religion and capitalism, informed by that, is that they're both forms of alienation. That we take all the qualities that inhere in us as humans and we project them outwards into an external entity, be it God or AI.
Yes.
So it's a way to relieve us of responsibility as well.
Yes.
And so there are these psychological drivers behind the AI development that are just not recognized or are just kind of dismissed as they're the humanities people talking about this in a very kind of poetic way. But this is a major part of what's going on here. Should we return? So
please.
So I think you really got the analysis right, that if the technocratic solutionism is the only thing that will work, but we don't have enough time for it to work, then we're gonna die anyway. So we have to hedge our bets and be okay, let's say we have a more medium-term timeline.
Yes.
Can we do anything that solves the structural alignment problem or
gets to a planetary scale coordination that we need?
Yes.
And that's the crucial thing. Just to say this, fundamentally, we have technology since the Second World War. That's the moment with nuclear weapons. For the first time in human history, we had weapons that could destroy the planet, that could wipe ourselves out, where existential threats, if you like, there had been asteroids could have come before, they wiped out the dinosaurs. But existential threats, now actually the primary source was us.
Yes, and this is towards the precipice, or the twin nuclei problem.
It goes back. Von Neumann has a paper in 1955, the wisdom gap, very early in the nuclear age. If not maybe before that, people thought about it. I would be interesting to look at science fiction or other speculative fiction. But
Asimov also says this.
But Asimov is post Second World War as well.
Right,
but what I mean is, von Neumann is writing in 55, and you've got all of this stuff after the nuclear bomb of we have technology that can wipe us out, and that we have this wisdom gap, as we could call it. We've used Life Itself. I know Center of Humane Technology also use, and others. It goes back, many quotes. I think you've got a very nice paper that I've seen where you have 20 quotes of people pointing out this wisdom gap, which is we have these technologies, and the gap between our technological development and our kind of cultural a collective wisdom or ability to manage technology in society has not grown nearly as quickly, or might have regressed. But there's this now suddenly huge gap. And that gap is also an existential risk gap because the technologies are so powerful.
So like Toby Ord, he identifies this as this is what is generating existential risk.
Yes.
And he's borrowing from Carl Sagan.
Yes.
Now, like in my piece, I point out that like Ord is framed as like today's Carl Sagan, and they're both like public communicators of science and like the risks that face humanity. So Sagan was talking more about nuclear war, Ord's talking about AI. So he's a clear like successor.
Yes.
Now they have very divergent reactions to this state of affairs. Carl Sagan was saying we should seriously consider restructuring civilization, our like economic, political, cultural, and religious systems.
Yes.
And that clearly the current systems don't have all the answers, and there could be many systems that exist that do. And so in the scientific tradition, our task is to find them, is his line. And so he has this open like scientific approach of let's like really search the solution space. And if we look at history, these transitions have occurred. And so why should we dismiss that possibility now? And I think this is quite compelling, and there seems to be this contradiction between long-termism in effective altruism, which is looking at the thousands of years into the future, and then this belief in the hinge of history, that we live in the most pivotal time that will shape the long-term future, and then also a belief at the same time in the end of history, that we've reached the final point of civilization's development, and we're not going to go further than this, at least anything other than like a transhumanist techno-utopian vision. And so, yes, I went on quite a tangent, but in my piece, what I do is kind of identify that there's like Ord is talking about how AI is the greatest existential risk because it will have extremely powerful capabilities and like values that aren't aligned with our own. And like, this is just a manifestation of the wisdom gap in a technological artifact. And so it was very surprising to me that like he talks about this wisdom gap and then talks about AI alignment as if they're not the same problem. And he doesn't kind of map on that it's like there's a civilizational alignment problem that is producing like an AI alignment problem. And you have to solve them both. And so, yeah, like I think he does this sleight of hand that you talk about. So yes.
The drunk, this sleight of hand of the drunk is very powerful, and it tends to put things off the table. It tends to deny their possibility or relevance. And why I think this is so important for evolving effective altruism, and why effective altruists could be so interested in these points, is that in a way, EA has demonstrated how quickly you can create, I guess, even like cultural change. I mean, the funny thing is effective altruism as a movement is a very powerful demonstration of the ability to change people's minds, to create a line of an aligned group that's really up to things, really has had real impact. So they're kind of a funny demonstration that cultural evolution or cultural shifts are possible. And even more, we can look at history. I think that's the other thing. So, I think there's a great quote, I'm going to misremember it, from, Ursula Le Guin about, we once thought the divine right of kings was, just what was so. And she's talking in our case actually about capitalism, I think, it's being like this now. So exactly on the point you've been talking about, but, people know the divine right of kings was the idea in the feudal system that the kings weren't just simply even got power. They were appointed by God. You could not dethrone the king because he was not only backed by power and the barons, but you were messing with the choice of God. And so you can imagine in a world that was, where religion was everywhere, how powerful that idea would have been. And yet you can see that has shifted. Very few people today, at least in the West, believe in the divine right of kings. And that shift is profound. And I think as profound as believing that the only way we can run things is capitalism, how antiquated that might seem if we survive another 1,000 years.
So the beginning of that quote it begins, any human power can be resisted.
Yeah.
And this is where the alienation and externalization occurs again, that now like capitalism and AI, they're perceived as alien powers, as non-human powers. And so we can't resist them. And so this is what in the accelerationist discourse, they're thinking of capitalism as a form of artificial superintelligence that's misaligned. And then also in the more EA and rationalist discourse, that the term they use is Moloch. And it's like they view
collective action problem.
They frame collective action problems through this mythological agentic lens of there is an entity, Moloch, and he's responsible for
not having the nice things, rather than seeing it as in ourselves and therefore transformable in ourselves.
So there's some kind of recognition of this, but I think it really needs to be emphasized that Moloch is like enacted through individuals and is immanent in the world.
Yes.
Right? It's not some like emergent, transcendent force.
Yes. Yes.
And that shift is then moving you towards, you have to solve your own like inner alignment problems, right? To not play these zero-sum competitive games. And so there's multi-scale alignment at all scales. We need to align
or coordinate.
Or coordination. Yes. So
just so for anyone who's not an effective altruist, alignment is the term we're using because it's used within the EA discourse so much for basically coordination, and we all do the washing up. Would be an EA would say, we've got a problem in our shared house. Some people are leaving dishes in the sink, and then other people are leaving dishes in the sink. Before you know it, the sink is a mess. That is an alignment problem in EA terminology, whereas I might call that a coordination problem.
I'd make a distinction. So
okay, good.
So
good
like with collective action problems, it's that there is an optimal overall outcome for everyone, and we all want that, but we can't achieve it because we're all pursuing these like short-term, narrow interests that are like optimal in the short term, but suboptimal in the long term. Now, it is also that like the AI race, for instance, is not just a collective action problem. There are also actors that are misaligned that actually want to develop the technology. And if it causes an existential event,
they're actually happy maybe.
Or like they'd rather that happen than someone else win and get the technology. And so there is both like value misalignment, where you have agents with objectives that are not in the interests of the whole and of the rest of the population. And then there are also collective action problems of everyone wants to survive, and the AI race is like threatening that.
It's a race to the bottom. So let's just go over that just for listeners, for us, because this is something we talk about in our polycrisis to metacrisis paper and also more recently. So let's just, the underlying, what people often term now Moloch, or just that we don't get the nice things, that we have an AI race, that we have the climate crisis, like we're emitting too much carbon, or we overfish the seas, we underproduce open source software. There's just many commons or other collective paradigms. There are really, we should distinguish three things. One is we could call like pure coordination problems. We actually all want outcome A, or at least a sufficient number of us for it to happen. But because it might be an incentive for me to deviate. If we could all lock in to do outcome A, like, no nuclear weapons, we do it. But because I think you're going to have a nuclear weapon, I better get them too.
Yes.
So that's point one. Point two is we could call value misalignment, where actually you just want nuclear weapons. You're just crazy, and you don't care whether I'm going to get them or not. You just want nuclear weapons. Like you want to have them around, or you want your super powerful AI. Even if there's a threat that it would wipe out everyone. And then, so what you said, that's kind of value. I would say, in our view, people have the wrong kind of values. And I would even argue in a deep way, that's not what they really want. As a Buddhist, I'd say there's kind of a deeper layer that people who want those kind of things is normally because there's some suffering on the top. But that's a deeper question. But essentially, one is coordination problems. Two is people kind of want the wrong stuff.
Yeah.
And the third, which we won't get today, is what I would call principal agent problems. That in order, or more broadly, like process design errors, that we want some outcome, like like the classic thing would be, we want to reduce pollution. We give out instead, we now actually pay people to reduce pollution by them demonstrating pollution capture, like they're capturing pollution. But now there's somebody incentivized to actually create pollution that they can then capture and get paid for. So we created an incentive that's looked good, but it actually incentivizes behavior we didn't want. Or the other very obvious example is currently certain versions of capitalism, where it kind of was a good idea as a system. It's like, okay, well, markets, market consumerism and markets, which is, okay, we're going to get more of the stuff we want. People are going to create, breakthrough health drugs. They're going to make the genes we want. They're going to make the cars we want. But there's this whole problem that it now cuts down the rainforest and turns everything into a commodity. But that I would call it as a principal agent problem, where the principal, in this case us, whether it's hiring someone else in the classic principal agent, like someone does sell my house, or I have an agent in the form of a system that I've designed, that agent and the principal are not perfectly aligned. There's a whole economics literature. I mean, the very obvious example, Max hires me to sell his house, and what commission do I get? I get like 3%. And you get 100%. So if I show up on a Saturday for one extra viewing, and as a result we get $2,000 extra for the house because there's a bit of competition, you get, if I'm doing my maths right, I get, what do I get? I think I get $60, if I'm doing my 3% correctly, of $2,000, and you get $1,940, right? So you get this hugely different amount. So am I going to bother showing up extra for $60? No. But you wanted me to. It would have been worth it for you. I'm giving you a technical example, but I'm just saying very, very simple cases we know about, like hiring someone to sell our house, anything that we can think of. This principal agent issue shows up. But those are the kind of provision. And it's true that one of the reasons I don't like the term Moloch, though I can understand its poetic attraction, is it's quite confusing about what we're actually talking about of those three. And it kind of has this agentic quality where we kind of like, oh, it's Moloch over there. It's like the devil.
Yes.
The devil's doing it to us rather than that we're doing it.
Yeah, so there is no Moloch, and yet there is a Moloch at the same time. So it's just like, you have to hold them both simultaneously. There is this emergent agency or like spontaneous disorder.
Or it's just the murmuration of the starlings, just as there's self-organization in capitalism.
Right,
yes.
Yeah. And so the system like emergently is like an agent that that has its own imperatives, like growth. And that conflicts with like sustainability, which is like a human goal. Like we want to keep surviving on the planet.
Right. And then we try and do things like correct and be like, oh, now we're going to write sustainability goals or we're going to have ESG investing. But we have this problem that really we've got a system that's mainly prioritizing this. And then we're trying to add a little bit of vector deviation.
Yes. So I think there are two like specification gaming problems in capitalism. So you set the objective of like maximize profits, or you set the objective of satisfy consumer preferences, and both of those are like ambiguous and vague, and like you can achieve them in a multiplicity of ways. Some of them are like highly misaligned. So like you can maximize profit by like manufacturing drugs that people get addicted to.
Yes.
You're completing the goal. So you needed to have like you needed to add a specification there of like maximize profit, but not in a way that like makes people addicted. So that's what law is. It's trying to bind these open-ended objectives.
I'm going to say something though about that. Wait a second. I don't think it's law. I think the way we did that traditionally, law is a manifestation of it, but
it's one tool
by norms. Ultimately, behind it was that you don't do that.
Right, it's wrong. There's a cultural stigma.
And famously, capitalism arose when in the context, for capitalism to actually kind of work, you need quite a lot of trust.
Right.
And so traditionally, it worked pretty well, capitalism, in groups that had high norms, not rules even, but high internal norms about not cheating, not lying.
Right. When it was the baker, the bread, and the candlestick maker,
or it was Quakers or Protestant. I mean, famously, Weber's essay, "The Protestant Spirit and the Ethic of Capitalism," is about how Protestantism is so crucial. I mean, partly it's about thrift and about accumulation. There's this kind of deep desire to accumulate, not to spend at that point, but almost to demonstrate you're good. You're successful as a merchant, almost as showing that you're one of the Calvinist elect, not to have stuff to spend, but also that honesty the underlying fact that you should be honest, that you should be thrifty, kind of makes capitalism sort of work. And today, capitalism is not working because it has become deformed. But I just really want to emphasize that it's really the cultural substrate that of which law is then a manifestation. And the issue is that law, I mean, this is just a very even simple economic technical point of incomplete contracting, but law can never do sufficient justice to the complexity of reality. So if we start trying to specify all the things that you should do when you maximize profit to not cause harm, it will never end. So we need some of those things, but ultimately we have principles and we require culture and our wisdom to enforce them, to turn them in. And this is again the connection from reason or at least a kind of narrow rationality to what I would call broad reason or even wisdom. For a complex economic system at a global scale to work, we have to have wisdom. It will not be sufficient to simply operate by the rules of the game because there will always be externalities. It will become so difficult. And this is the Viveki, relevance realization, all of these things. How do I, in this kind of combinatorial complexity of the world, how do we make decisions together that lead to well outcomes? Well, we need to cultivate wisdom.
Yeah, so this is like the AI safetists really recognize this, that because we can't solve moral philosophy, we can't just put in these are the rules that you have to follow.
Yes, exactly.
The AI will always find loopholes and solutions that you didn't expect, and so you can't design this perfectly aligned system. And so that's why the AI alignment is by the doomerists is just viewed as intractable. And so this is
I wouldn't say, just say, the way I'd see it is, hey, one is that wisdom would counsel patience for us as humanity, that we're rushing. It's like, maybe we can use knives safely, but I'm not going to give my 2-year-old a knife. There's a point, we can use knives safely and they are useful. Similarly with AI, I don't know, maybe it would turn out we could never develop it safely, but it would be, at least in my mind, tantamount to bringing up the most precious child we've ever had. And yet look at the way we treat child development and education today. I mean, I would suspect more money is spent certainly on developing AI, and certainly maybe more money is spent on even developing an iPhone than is spent on developing education and child development research last year in the whole of the world. And so I'm just saying, it would be tantamount to bring up a child. I don't give my son a massive operating manual and say, when every situation, son, that you encounter in life, go to page, look in the index, it's page 257, paragraph 4, I'm on a date and the girl has said this, now I have to do that. No, you have patterns and principles that you learn.
Right, there's a procedural knowledge.
Or process development, yes. Yeah. I mean, I'm not trying to say I'm trying to solve the alignment problem, but I'm saying if I were even interested, those would be the kind of areas I'd be looking. I mean, personally, right now, I'd be like, I think the only wise course would be say, listen, we should be really trying to go much lower. Juggling with ever sharper knives, when you keep adding knives, it's just going to cut your hand off. But that's a slightly, I want to kind of come back, but as we were trying to say, what does pragmatic utopian look like? We should kind of come wrap ourselves up for this session, is to say, okay, there's several, the most crucial, I think, part we were coming to at the end there was say, okay, when we want to solve, I would call them broadly collective action problems, this Moloch things, they are solvable. That's the part of it. They are solvable. They have been solved in human history. We have grown the scale at which we can solve collective action problems. One way you say we fought bigger wars. And that involves solving people to fight together side by side and to die for one another requires incredible solving a collective. Why should I not just run away and leave you to fight? When me disappearing won't make a difference to the battle. But obviously, if we all do that, then we all die. So we have solved these things. That is solvable, and the main way we've solved it is through culture, cultural evolution of some kinds. Even certain kind, you could say religion. And capitalism is a religion.
Right. So in the military example, people believe in fighting for king and country,
or for their brothers and sisters.
Imagined community.
Yes. Imagined communities.
The self of a boundary has collapsed. They now perceive themselves as part of a whole.
Yes.
Rather than as an external entity that has its own.
Right. And that could maybe be misused at certain times, but in general, that has been some of the source of the most wonderful thing in human history. And the most interesting question, I think, for me, one of the most interesting questions for me, can we have that kind of transcendence of the I, but not in a submergence back into some kind of pre-modern tribal ego, into the Nuremberg rally, where I submerge myself in some group where I give away my agency. But is there a way where I can retain agency and autonomy in some way, and yet grow into the bigger groups, which we can see there are ways which we can do. I mean, I think even some of the interest in co-creation, which is a term everyone uses nowadays, flat self-organizing teams that have emerged all over the place. We have this interest in ways where we can create bigger us's and yet retain our agency and autonomy in some deep way. Because I think that's the other fear people have, is this means going back. We're going to have torchlit rallies, and before you know it, we'll be having the Inquisition again. No, can we go forward, and can we go to a planetary scale of care, and not just for all humans, but all life, and yet, retain what is wonderful. Not merged into some superorganism, but really becoming a bigger whole. And so I think that's also that the point is that we can look at human history, and while we can't see this stage of change because it's never happened before, we can see that happening in the past. We can see the growth of bigger wholes, and we see, like the nation state, people actually, it's a good example where in many cases the democratic nation state, it gave more empowerment and more agency while also connecting people in bigger whole. They were no longer, I'm a Yorkshireman, I'm an Englishman. They still might also be a Yorkshireman, but there's this kind of translation into the bigger whole. And that, I think, is one of the great possibilities of our time. As I said, to finish, one of the great, maybe, given this area is, I think, somewhat neglected within effective altruism, and is a real opportunity for evolution. Effective altruism is itself a demonstration of this kind of cultural evolution or innovation as a community and movement. Anything last words you want to say, Max, to close out for today's session?
Yes, I mean, this like theory of history as one of moral circle expansion is held within effective altruism, and yet they're not applying it to like the cultural and political level.
Yes,
and like it seems like a simple thing to do. It's like now, like, what does this mean? It's like, do the US, China, and Russia become one?
What does that actually mean? And that's what we could come to. Just as a trailer, I think. The question people will be begging to be pragmatic utopians and to be credible is, well, how does that happen? How how do we all just sing hands and sing Kumbaya? No. And so that, I think, is something to do with, it has to take us a little bit further afield into human psychology, wisdom traditions such as Buddhism and cognitive development. But to kind of leave a seed there, I think that the inner sciences, the science, psychology, if we want to put it in conventional terms, cognitive science, neuroscience, I would actually say things like Buddhism, applied phenomenology, from which are the ways like Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and so on, really give a lot, are really in their infancy, but are already showing great promise. And they, I think, are perhaps the science of the next age. The science of modernity was the science of matter. That was the breakthrough. Physics, chemistry, biology. At this point, it's a breakthrough, I think, even to the biology and beyond, to the ecological sciences, to the system sciences, but also in the inner sciences, which really, for only 150 years, but really 100 or even 50 years old. I mean, cognitive science emerges in 60s and 70s. Cybernetics, systems theory, and so on, are really recent developments. And these are the science of the future. I mean, jokingly, I should say, because Oxford is the cradle of effective altruism. The well-known course there, at least for people who want to go into policy, is PPE. Philosophy, politics, and economics. And I often think that should become, basically psychology, politics, and ecology in the future. Yes. And that shift is there. So I think that's the last part of this, among maybe several other things we should cover, is what is the credible story of how cultural evolution can come about? Why is it something that should be invested energy in? What's next?
Yeah, so like
add on, please.
Yeah, you see the wisdom gap manifesting in academic disciplines and the sciences, that our technological and material disciplines have advanced beyond our psychological and social disciplines. And like this is something that Comte noticed, that like he had this model of the hierarchy of the sciences, and that sociology was the queen science, but it would be the last one to come into maturity, and it was reliant on all the other sciences below it first. And so
it's in the holonic model. Yes, it's the top holon.
So there is this kind of perhaps teleological fear of history that there will be this great alignment, or like the closing of the wisdom gap, where we will have a mature science of the mind and science of society, and that will mean we can manage our currently ungoverned technological powers. So that's a very like abstract and like philosophical and historical view, and perhaps next time we can get to talking more about like what does this actually translate to in practice.
Well, with that, thanks for now, everyone, and catch us on the next episode.